I grew up surrounded by lights, stages, and applause. The world saw me as someone who had everything: fame, opportunities, and connections. But behind the spotlights, there were dark nights of loneliness. The emptiness was so deep that not even the most lucrative contracts could fill it. My name is Sarah Levy. I am 50 years old, and I live in the United States. I was born into a Jewish family connected to the artistic world, where culture and entertainment shaped our identity. I grew up surrounded by rehearsals, stages, and backstage corridors, believing that this world of fame and glamour would be enough to fill my life. But behind the smiles and apparent achievements, there was an emptiness no one could see. Not even I could explain it. Questions about purpose and about who God really was always followed me, even when I tried to ignore them. Before continuing with my story of conversion, write in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know how far this testimony is reaching. Despite the grandeur that surrounded my routine, I increasingly realized that it was all nothing more than a carefully built performance. The red carpets, the constant flashes, and the flawless smiles were, in reality, masks hiding painful truths. Behind the dressing rooms, I saw well-known celebrities drinking to forget, crying in silence, or confessing that they felt empty, even after reaching what many would call the peak of life. That contradiction shocked me. How was it possible that people who seemed to have everything were so lost? I wondered if deep down, I was living the same lie. After all, when the curtains closed and I was alone, the feeling was identical. A void that neither million-dollar contracts nor prolonged applause could fill. It was as if, with every achievement, I discovered that joy lasted only a moment and soon dissolved, leaving me even more restless. I began to realize that the weight of appearances was not only on the shoulders of those I observed, but also on mine. I smiled in interviews, said I was fulfilled, that I was proud of my work, but inside me, something screamed for a greater purpose. Many times, when I returned home after glamorous events, I removed my makeup and looked at myself in the mirror, trying to recognize who I truly was. And most of the time, I found no answer. It was in that contrast, between the public image and the intimate reality, that a disturbing question arose. If fame doesn't bring happiness, then what really does? That question followed me in every backstage moment, every performance, every lonely night. I realized that I was surrounded by people who constantly searched for something more success, more money, more recognition, yet still remained dissatisfied. Over time, that same feeling forced me to look inward. I realized that, like them, I too was chasing after something I couldn't define, and that search began to feel unbearable. The glitter that once fascinated me now felt like a burden. I didn't want to live only for appearances. I wanted to discover the truth about myself and about life. My grandfather's passing happened suddenly, leaving behind a pain I couldn't disguise, even with the commitments of my artistic life. He had always been a safe harbor for me, someone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. The silence that followed his absence was deeper than any empty stage. For the first time, death stopped being a distant idea and became something concrete, something capable of taking away the people I loved. During that time, every memory of my grandfather brought to mind a disturbing question. Where is he now? I tried to hold on to what I had learned from family tradition, but the answers sounded vague, without depth. The ceremonies seemed more like social customs than a bridge to understanding the mystery of existence. It felt like being in a maze where everyone repeated rituals, but no one knew the real path. I remember nights when I closed my eyes and prayed, but I wasn't sure if my words reached anywhere. It was like speaking into the void. I wanted to believe that my grandfather could somehow hear me, that his essence hadn't vanished, but I found no solid ground to sustain that hope. The spiritual emptiness began to pile up on the emotional emptiness, forming an unbearable weight. Meanwhile, life around me went on as if nothing had happened. Friends and colleagues invited me to parties, trying to distract me from the pain, but the loud music and forced laughter only deepened the contrast within me. I realized people were afraid to talk about death, as if ignoring it would make it disappear. For me, it was impossible. My grandfather's absence forced me to face the fragility of life. It was in that moment that the search for meaning stopped being a curiosity and became a necessity. I could no longer settle for superficial answers or consoling phrases that faded into the air. I needed to understand if there was something beyond this world, if a creator really existed, and if my life had a greater purpose than simply being born, working, and dying. The blow of reality pulled me out of the stupor I had been living in and made me realize that no matter how much brilliance the world offered, everything could vanish in an instant. That realization planted a seed that would later grow into a sincere and profound search for God. Before continuing, I want to say that during that time, I learned that Allah asks us to take care not only of our faith, but also of the body He entrusted to us. That is why I want to recommend something that can help, a practical guide to healthy living, which includes how to maintain discipline, energy, and balance. And as an additional gift, this material also brings a special guide on ruqya and spiritual protection to strengthen not only the body, but also the heart. Backstage was always sold as a place of dreams, where fame seemed to turn everything into gold. But when the lights went out and the stages were empty, what I witnessed was a scene of despair. I was surrounded by people the world idolized, but who in silence confessed to pains that not all the money in the world could relieve. I remember nights when celebrities, after making crowds scream, locked themselves in dressing rooms and drowned their loneliness in alcohol or drugs. I saw lost gazes, trembling hands, and phrases repeated like a cry for help. I have everything, but I have nothing. That marked me irreversibly. How could someone applauded by thousands feel so empty? At other times, the situation was even more disturbing. I heard confessions spoken with a trembling voice from artists who said they felt evil forces suffocating them. Some even claimed they were being chased by something invisible, a presence that would not let them rest. I was very young, but I already understood these were not just exaggerations. There was a spiritual weight there, a void no earthly achievement could fill. That reality hit me like a shock. I grew up believing that the peak of life was reaching the spotlight, but now I realized the glitter was only a facade. If those with fortune, fame, and power were trapped in chains of fear and unhappiness, what could be said of me, who only dreamed of reaching that point? The illusion shattered before my eyes. Over time, I began to see those encounters as a mirror. What I saw in others was a reflection of what could happen to me if I continued believing that success was the answer to everything. It was like watching a future I didn't want to be part of, a silent warning that such a path ended in ruins. While many applauded the seemingly perfect lives of those people, I could no longer look at them the same way. Instead of inspiration, I felt compassion. I understood they were as fragile as anyone else, perhaps even more so, because they carried the pressure of maintaining an image that didn't match reality. It was in that contrast between outer shine and inner emptiness that the restlessness inside me grew even stronger. I didn't want to lose myself in the same illusions. Something in my heart whispered that there was another path, but I still didn't know what it was. The mirror of celebrities showed me that happiness wasn't in what the world exalted, and that realization opened the way for a search that would change my entire life. During that period of silent questioning, something unexpected happened. One of my closest friends, with whom I shared dreams and secrets, told me that she had converted to Islam. I was speechless. My immediate reaction was disbelief. How could someone so full of life, with so many plans in the same artistic world as mine, abandon it all to follow a faith that, to me, seemed strange and even limiting? In my mind, Islam meant restrictions, renunciation, and loss of identity. I couldn't hide the criticism that rose within me. You're going to waste your career, your freedom. You're going to throw your life away. I said it almost as an accusation, without realizing that, in truth, those were reflections of my own fear. I was afraid of losing the little I believed I had achieved, and seeing my friend take a path I didn't understand shook my fragile certainties. However, time revealed something I couldn't ignore. When we met, she was no longer the same anxious young woman I had known. There was in her eyes a serenity I had never seen before. Her words were firm but not arrogant. The way she treated people, the calm with which she faced difficulties, the conviction in every gesture, everything about her conveyed a peace that contrasted with the emptiness I silently carried. I tried to convince myself it was just a phase, that it would soon pass. But instead, she seemed more and more grounded. While the world around us chased parties, contracts, and applause, She radiated a tranquility that depended on nothing external. It was as if she had found an invisible source of strength and purpose. That contrast began to trouble me. As much as I wanted to reject her choice, I couldn't avoid the comparisons within me. Which of us was truly living in freedom? Me, who appeared to have everything but went to bed with doubts and anguish, or her, who had given up so much but radiated conviction and peace? It was at that point that my walls began to crack. Her presence became a constant reminder that maybe I was wrong about Islam, not because she preached to me or tried to convince me, but because her life was the very evidence that there was something there I still didn't understand. The initial shock gave way to an uncomfortable curiosity. For the first time, I considered that maybe the answer to my questions wasn't in the glow of the stage or in material achievements, but in a faith I had always dismissed. Her conversion became a stone in my shoe, an unease I could no longer ignore. There were nights when sleep simply wouldn't come, and my mind spun in circles of questions I couldn't silence. On one of those silent dawns, I heard a soft sound coming from the next room. It was my friend. She was in prayer, performing Fajr, the prayer Muslims make before the sun even rises. At first, I thought of ignoring it, but something made me pay attention. I stood still, watching from a distance, barely breathing. There was no audience, no cameras, no applause. It was just her, the mat on the floor, and a devotion so genuine that it completely disarmed me. Every gesture carried an invisible yet tangible connection. In that moment, for the first time, I felt a strange desire. I wanted to experience the same serenity I saw in her eyes when she finished praying. The next morning, she noticed the different look in my eyes. She didn't ask anything right away, but later, gently, she said, "You stayed awake last night, didn't you? You watched the prayer?" I nodded, embarrassed, unsure of how to respond. Then she told me something that echoed deeply within me. "If you truly want to know the truth, ask God for a sign. He doesn't deny an answer to someone who asks sincerely." Those words kept resounding inside me. It wasn't a sermon, nor an attempt to convince me. It was simply a direct invitation, almost impossible to ignore. For years I had prayed in moments of despair, never sure who was listening. But now there was a different challenge, to cry out not to a ritual I had inherited or to a distant God, but to the Creator, honestly, without masks. That very night, I closed my bedroom door, turned off my phone, and without really knowing how to begin, I whispered, "God, if what she follows is truly your truth, show me somehow. I don't want to live confused anymore. I need clarity." There were no thunders, no immediate revelations, but I felt a strange lightness, as if, by voicing that sincere plea, something invisible had moved. In the days that followed, I began noticing things I had once ignored. Words from the Quran that she mentioned in simple conversations seemed to answer old questions I had never dared to ask. Small signs began to appear, coincidences, encounters, even dreams that made me wake up with a racing heart. It was in that process that doubt ceased to be just an annoyance and turned into a true search. It was no longer about watching my friend from afar, but about slowly beginning to take steps towards something I had never thought possible for myself. The nights remained heavy, filled with thoughts and a silence that seemed to scream inside me. I had already made that sincere prayer, asking the Creator for a sign, but I still didn't know what to expect. Then, on a night I will never forget, something happened that marked my life forever. In the dream, I found myself in a dark place, almost suffocating. The walls were high, the floor cold, and there were armed guards everywhere. Their eyes carried hatred, and it didn't take long for them to notice something in me that disturbed them. One of them shouted firmly, "She is a Muslim!" Startled, I looked around, trying to understand what was happening. I wasn't wearing a veil, I wasn't praying, but it seemed they could see straight into my soul. The guards came closer, and the tension grew with every step. One of them raised his weapon and aimed it at me. At that moment, my heart raced as if it would explode in my chest. Death seemed inevitable. Then, in absolute desperation, without thinking, I just cried out, "Allah!" Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. A soft wind, almost like a spring breeze, blew over me. That wind didn't just touch my skin, it lifted me. I felt my body rise from the ground, as if I were being carried safely away from danger. Looking down, I saw the guards in shock, unable to reach me, their weapons useless against that invisible force. The fear that had paralyzed me was replaced by an indescribable sense of peace. In the dream, I passed through a tall gate and entered a bright field where there were people at peace, smiling, radiating tranquility. It was as if that wind had placed me in a safe refuge, a space no one could violate. I woke up suddenly, with tears streaming down my face. My heart beat so fast, it felt like it echoed through the entire room. But along with the crying, there was a relief I couldn't explain. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had dreamt just anything. I was convinced it was an answer. It was as if Allah had shown me that even in the midst of fear and persecution, He could protect me and guide me to safety. I spent the day reflecting on every detail: the scene, the guards, the weapon, the wind, the passage into a place of light. Everything seemed to carry a deep meaning. I couldn't ignore the vivid memory of that moment when I called upon Allah and was saved. I understood it was more than a dream. It was a calling, a direct invitation to trust, to take a step toward the path I had been avoiding out of fear or prejudice. When I told my friend, her eyes filled with tears. She said, "Leah, what you described is in the words of the Prophet Muhammad, who spoke of a gentle wind that, at the end of times, will carry the souls of the believers to safety." I froze in silence. How could I dream of something like that without ever having studied Islam in depth? The clearest explanation was only one. God was answering my prayers in the most personal way possible. At that moment, a certainty began to grow inside me. I wasn't facing a coincidence, but a divine calling. The dream didn't erase my doubts instantly, but it lit a flame in me that could not be ignored. From then on, every step I took in search of knowledge seemed to bring me closer to the truth I so deeply longed to find. After that transformative experience, I realized there was no use running anymore. I could keep repeating the old arguments I had heard all my life, but something inside me had already changed. I understood that if I truly wanted answers, I would have to seek them at the source. No more distorted comments, prejudiced headlines, or phrases torn out of context. I needed to face the Quran myself, without intermediaries. So one afternoon, I entered an Islamic bookstore in New York. My heart was racing, as if I were committing something forbidden. I picked up a copy translated into English, a version recommended by serious scholars, and took it with me. I remember coming home, closing my bedroom door, and holding the book with trembling hands. It felt like I was holding something that could completely change my life. That night, I opened the first pages cautiously, almost afraid of what I would find. But instead of hostility, I found tenderness. The first verse I read spoke about the mercy of Allah, the compassionate and merciful. Those words echoed in my heart like a balm. Never before had a religious text spoken to me so intimately, so directly. I kept reading and was surprised. There were reflections about the sky, the earth, the seas, the animals, all presented as signs for human beings to recognize the Creator. I, who had spent years surrounded by the superficial glitter of the arts, began to see the beauty of life in a different way. Every detail of nature seemed to carry purpose. The Quran didn't speak only to the intellect, but also to the soul. The verses about social justice struck me in a special way. Words that defended the orphan, the widow, the poor, and the oppressed showed me a side of Islam I had never heard of. How could a religion be accused of harshness when its own scriptures cried out for compassion and fairness? That gradually tore down the walls of prejudice I had built since childhood. As the days went by, each reading became a meeting with myself. It was as if every page tore down a lie I had carried for years. Accusations that Islam promoted hatred, devalued people, or encouraged violence found no support in the words I was reading. On the contrary, what I found were warnings against injustice, reminders of human responsibility, and constant invitations to seek God's forgiveness. I remember one night when I closed the Quran and sat in silence, looking out the window. Outside, the city lights shone brightly, but inside me, something else was shining. I felt as if Allah was calling me to a path that no longer depended on the approval of the world, but only on the sincerity of my heart. It was then I realized it wasn't just a book I was reading out of intellectual curiosity. It was a living dialogue, a meeting between my thirst for answers and the source offering water in abundance. The Quran wasn't a book of hatred, but of guidance. It wasn't a threat, but an invitation. And the more I read, the clearer it became that my life could no longer remain the same after that contact. The decision to continue diving into those pages wasn't easy. I knew that if I took the next step, I would face resistance, criticism, and even rejection. But I also knew there was no turning back. I had found something that answered the deepest questions of my soul, and it was impossible to pretend nothing had happened. For weeks, I kept the change happening inside me a secret. Each reading of the Quran, each improvised silent prayer, was a hidden treasure. But the day came when I could no longer live divided between two identities. I needed to be honest with my family, even if it cost me dearly. I gathered courage at a simple dinner, believing I could calmly explain my choices. My voice trembled when I said, "I have found answers in Islam, and I want to follow this path." The silence at the table was heavy, almost suffocating. My mother lowered her eyes, my sister left the room without a word, and my father broke down in tears mixed with anger. The words that came out of his mouth cut through me like knives. "I'd rather see you as a prostitute than a Muslim." I was paralyzed. How could the man who taught me to ride a bike, who applauded my school performances, say something so cruel? I felt the ground vanish beneath my feet. It was as if, in that moment, I had lost not only my family's support, but also my place in the world. That night, I locked myself in my room and cried until I had no strength left. The pain wasn't just from the insult, but from the certainty that my choice was creating an abyss between me and those I had always considered my safe harbor. I thought of giving up, of stepping back, of going back to being the acceptable daughter they expected. But deep down, something greater held me. The conviction that this wasn't a whim, but a truth I had found. The days that followed were even harder. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from relatives who wanted to convince me to come back to my senses. Some said I was shaming the family's bloodline. Others insisted Islam was a prison and that I was destroying my life. The words piled up like stones, weighing heavily on my shoulders. But amid tears and arguments, I began to notice something new inside me, a strength I never knew I had. For the first time, I understood that true faith requires sacrifice. It isn't about pleasing everyone, but about standing firm even when it costs relationships, opportunities, and even the love of those who matter most. I started seeking refuge in the early hours of the morning when the house was asleep. I would quietly open the Quran and let its words calm my heart. Each verse seemed to respond to my pain, reminding me that even the prophets faced rejection from their families but remained faithful to God. That reminder gave me hope that one day, perhaps, my father would understand. Even while wounded, I chose not to retaliate. I didn't yell, I didn't return insults. I respected their space, even though it hurt to be treated like a stranger. I learned that patience is also an act of faith. In the midst of tears, I discovered that Allah never abandons those who seek Him sincerely, and that was enough to keep me standing. The rejection was a deep blow, but it was also the final proof that my life had changed. I no longer sought human approval. I sought closeness to Allah, and if that was the price to pay, I was willing to face it, because deep down, I understood that losing everything for God is never a loss, but the beginning of a truer and freer life. It took me months to gather the courage. The idea of sharing my journey publicly terrified me. For years, my life had been marked by lights and stages, but always under the control of a carefully built image. Now, for the first time, I didn't want to play a role or appear perfect. I just wanted to be myself, a woman who had been lost in the false glitter of fame and who had finally found a real purpose. When I sat in front of the camera, my hands trembled. The silence before pressing the record button felt heavier than any audience of thousands I had ever faced. I took a deep breath and began to speak. The words came out like a confession held back for years. I spoke about my childhood surrounded by artists, about the pressure to be admired, and about the emptiness that consumed my nights, even when the audience applauded me. I spoke about the shock of seeing celebrities confess their fears at lavish parties, revealing that fame was only a mask hiding deep pain. I shared the impact of watching my friends surrender to Islam, the serenity in her eyes that intrigued me so much, and the striking dream I had, where Allah showed me that only He could save me. I described in detail how I decided to pick up the Quran for the first time, and how those pages completely changed the way I saw life, death, and the purpose of existence. As I spoke, tears welled up. They weren't tears of shame, but of liberation. For the first time, I wasn't hiding my weaknesses. On the contrary, I was exposing my wounds as proof that healing is possible. I also spoke about my family's rejection, especially my father's harsh words, and how that made me understand that true faith requires sacrifice. With each sentence, I felt my heart grow lighter. It was as if my story stopped being mine alone and became a testimony capable of reaching hearts around the world. I knew that many people, just like I once was, were living in silence with the same doubts, the same emptiness, and perhaps needed to hear that there is hope beyond what money or fame can offer. Ending the video, I left a clear message that Allah had transformed my life when I no longer saw a way out, and that He could do the same for anyone who sincerely seeks Him. I looked straight into the camera and said, "I'm not here to impress anyone, but to say that the peace I searched for my whole life, I found in Islam. And here I want to open my heart. If this story touched you, consider supporting this channel through the Super Thanks button. That contribution helps bring stories like mine to even more people who need to hear that Allah transforms lives." Today, I look back and see two versions of the same person, the young woman chasing applause and the woman who found peace in the presence of Allah. Before, I believed happiness was in million-dollar contracts, in parties full of cameras, in the famous names I had around me. But every achievement ended in a painful silence within my soul. Today, I live a simple life, far from the stages, but close to what truly matters, the faith that gives me strength to face any difficulty. True freedom didn't come when I achieved fame, but when I stopped being a slave to the opinions of others. I discovered I don't need to prove anything to anyone beyond living in obedience to my Creator. The joy that sustains me no longer depends on applause, but on each prayer made with sincerity, on each day lived with purpose, on each reminder that Allah guided me when I was lost. I know my story isn't only about me. It's also about all those who hide doubts and fears behind an appearance of success. Maybe you are in such a phase now, trying to fill emptiness with things that cannot heal. I want you to know that there is a different path, and that path is open to any heart that desires to draw closer to Allah. My journey taught me that the rejection of people is never greater than the acceptance of God. The scorn I faced at home, the lost opportunities at work, all of it became steps that brought me to where I am today. And I can say with full conviction, nothing in the world compares to the tranquility of knowing you belong to something greater than any career or status. That's why I want to ask you, the one watching, share this video in groups, on social media, and with the people you love. Maybe someone you know is waiting for this very message to believe that hope is real, that change is possible, and that Allah never abandons those who seek Him with an open heart. My life is proof of that, and perhaps yours can become so too.